Greetings, attendees at the Jane Addams Conference at the University of Warsaw. My name is Bridget O'Rourke, and I'm at Elmhurst University, where I serve as professor of English. I'm 20 miles west of the city of Chicago and the Hull House settlement on the near west side. Thank you to the conference organizers and to the attendees for allowing me to give this presentation virtually. I'm with you in the spirit of Jane Addams, but I regret that I'm not able to join you in person. Hilda Satt Polacheck is best known for her autobiography, I Came a Stranger, The Story of a Hull House Girl, the only known memoir of Hull House written by an immigrant woman. Polacheck arrived in Chicago as a child in 1892, and she wrote the memoir decades later during the 1950s and 1960s, but could not find a publisher before her death in 1967. Her daughter, Dina Epstein, edited and published the work in 1989. I Came a Stranger explores Jane Addams' influence as a mentor in Polacheck's early life and her experiences becoming an American at Hull House at the turn of the century. Hilda Satt was born in 1882 in Włocławek, Poland, in the Russian-occupied settlement zone where Jews were legally permitted to live. Like many new immigrants, her family fled to the US to escape religious persecution and conscription into the Tsar's army. By her own account, Hilda's life was transformed by her experiences at the Hull House settlement and her friendship with Jane Addams. In March of 1894, 2 years after the family arrived in Chicago, and in a deepening economic depression, Hilda's father died suddenly, casting the family into dire poverty. During the winter of 1896, at the age of 13, Hilda quit school to work in a sweatshop. Around 1900, she began to visit Hull House regularly after her 10-hour shifts, sewing shirts at a shirtwaist factory. In her memoir, Polacheck described Hull House as an oasis in the desert of sweatshop labor, the monotony of which was worse than the actual work. This is a photo of Hilda at the Hull House Labor Museum, demonstrating the spinning exhibit in full Russian peasant costume. I Came a Stranger ends with the funeral of Jane Addams in 1935, even though Polacheck lived more than 3 decades after the death of her influential mentor. Historian Betty Berglund has argued that ending the autobiography with Addams' death signifies the ideological power of Hull House reform discourses. Furthermore, she suggests that Polacheck's autobiographical authority and even her existence as an autobiographical subject was subsumed by that of her influential mentor. In a sense, Berglund writes, autobiographical Polacheck dies with Addams. However, evidence outside the scope of the memoir, including records from the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI, reveal other more oppressive constraints on Hilda Polacheck's autobiographical authority. My research on Hilda's life and work after the memoir ended in 1935, my interviews with her family members, and evidence I obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests revealed that the FBI was spying on Hilda and her family members during the 1940s and 50s due to their leftist political beliefs. This untold story helped me to better appreciate the broad network of constraints on Hilda's discursive agency. I also came to admire her collective efforts to resist those constraints, establish political legitimacy, and effect social change. Jane Addams' essay, The Chicago Settlements and Social Unrest, responded to the outrage that followed Chicago Chief of Police George Shippey's fatal shooting of 18-year-old Lazarus Averbach, a Russian Jewish immigrant who had appeared at Shippey's home on March 7th, 1908. The newspapers portrayed Shippey as a brave officer who fended off and killed an anarchist immigrant, which triggered waves of anti-immigrant sentiment among Chicago's native-born citizens. Addams offered her middle-class readers a counter-narrative. Her Russian Jewish neighbors saw the incident instead as a false flag operation in which a man in the employ of the Russian government encouraged Averbach to go to the chief's home as a setup to create an incident that could be used to justify attacks on the Russian immigrant community. At the time, Addams was at the height of her public esteem as the authoritative voice of the settlement. However, her right to speak as an interpreter on behalf of the Russian Jewish community was called into question by an event implying anarchy. Such as the Averbach incident. At such times of fervid denunciation, she wrote, the overwrought community became suspicious of the settlement's efforts to represent the voices and perspectives of the immigrants they served. Addams' efforts to understand the immigrants' perspectives and calm overwrought citizens were at once taken to imply a championship of anarchy itself. In spite of this risk of guilt by association, Addams insisted that the social settlements would have no real social value if they were not ready to stake the sober results of their experience and their moral convictions against the hasty opinion of the moment, no matter the consequences. In this way, Addams both spoke for the Russian Jewish immigrant community and distanced herself from their provocative claims. She quoted one Russian Jewish immigrant as saying, "All our radicals are socialists, not anarchists. We are not such fools as to pursue the method of terrorism in a country where there is free speech and an opportunity for agitation. To attach anarchy to us means persecution, plain Jew baiting, and nothing else." Addams proceeded to denounce the violent aggression of police power and to cast doubt on the official view of the shooting victim, who was framed by police as well as journalists as a terrorist and anarchist. Addams reported the suspicions of Russian Jews that Chicago police were falling victim to the Russian Empire, who is attempting to discredit and break up immigrant groups in the U.S. they suspected of funding Russian revolutionaries. Addams wrote that the immigrant community believes that these agents of the Russian government are constantly seeking to influence public opinion, adding that the American public is taking it in exactly the way that makes it most valuable to the Russians. Addams insisted that the only way to allay these suspicions was to clarify facts and to properly investigate the matter in a way that would reinforce immigrants' faith in the basic principles of democracy. Instead, Chicago police had raided the immigrants' shops, seized private libraries, desecrated the victim's corpse, and mercilessly sweated his sister in a days-long interrogation. This story is told in a historical novel, The Lazarus Project. These were familiar tactics among immigrants from the Russian settlement areas, whose past experiences had shown that the police, backed many times by the Cossack soldiers, are the final executors and interpreters of autocracy. Addams further contended in the Charities and the Commons article that the Averbach shooting was the opportune moment for teaching through direct experience the constitutional basis of American government to that very body of people who need it most, to those who have had experience in Russia where autocratic officers represent autocratic powers. In order to demonstrate beyond the possibility of misunderstanding that the guarantee of constitutional rights implies that officialism shall be restrained and guarded against at every point. Addams lamented that the case proved instead that the Republican government right on its own grounds and in the hands of its friends, should have fallen into the Russian method of dealing with a similar incident, and that because the community was in a state of panic, it should have connived at and apparently approved of these very drastic methods on the part of the police. In this way, Addams denounced the public panic engendered by official misconduct and misinformation, while she invoked the dominant community's capacity for reasoned judgment and openness to the voices and perspectives of others, which are essential to deliberative democracy. Shortly after the publication of Addams' essay, Hilda Satt, Polacheck's maiden name, wrote a letter to the editor of Charities in the Commons that illustrates the complex interaction of settlement authority and immigrant agency. She began her letter by praising Addams' essay. She wrote, "I want to thank you for bringing before the public the splendid paper, The Chicago Settlements and Social Unrest by Miss Jane Addams. Now it seems to me is the proper time for a foreigner to say a word, and I, as a Russian Jewess, want to say mine." Hilda's rhetorical performance highlights the importance of the opportune moment as embodied actors enact mutually responsive agency over time and in complex dynamic systems. In her Charities in the Commons letter, Polacheck established her provisional authority as an immigrant who was glad to be an American, although she was not yet a citizen, and whose impressions of the greatness of the country were conveyed by the public school, the social settlement, and the Russian Jewish community itself. Yet her ideas of American liberty were challenged by the killing of Averbach, a young Russian Jewish immigrant like herself. As a participant in Hull House's Little Theater, Polacheck had learned well the motto, "Act well your part." And she acted well the part of a young Jewish immigrant woman whose authority was constrained by her immigrant status, gender, class, and religion. Her letter dramatized the fear and suspicion engendered by the Averbach affair. When she spoke of it at home, she was silenced by her mother, who warned, "Speak quietly. A policeman lives next door." A remark such as I had not heard her utter since we left Russia. Satt wondered, what had happened? Was I back in Russia? Or was America becoming another Russia? With those timely words, Hilda Satt affirmed Jane Addams' claim that the experiences of Jews who had fled the Russian-occupied settlement areas encountered in Chicago the same persecution from which they had sought to escape. Satt concluded her letter by sharing what she had learned about civic responsibility at Hull House. Hilda and her immigrant neighbors learned that if we lived up to what America expected of the immigrant, we would in return be given protection, freedom of assemblage, free speech, and a free press. The settlements have taught well. Has Chicago done her part? Satt's capacity to publicly question and challenge the civic authority of the city of Chicago during a time of social rest enacted her social agency. As Marilyn Cooper points out, change happens not as the effect of a discrete cause, but from the dance of perturbation and response as agents interact. With her marriage to Bill Polacheck in 1912, Hilda Satt became a U.S. citizen. She moved to Milwaukee, a city 90 miles north of Chicago, where she remained politically active and campaigned in support of causes championed by Jane Addams, including women's suffrage and anti-war movements. In 1921, Polacheck joined the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, following a lecture by Jane Addams, the League's founding president. Polacheck attended the first U.S. meeting of the League's International Congress. On the issue of women's suffrage, Hilda diverged from Jane Addams by joining the National Women's Party, a militant suffrage organization. In the midst of this good life, Bill died suddenly in 1927. Within 2 years of Bill's death, the family business failed despite Hilda's best efforts. By 1930, she was bankrupt and prepared to return to Chicago with her 4 children. In the memoir, she wrote of this time of grief as a nightmare, but she credited Jane Addams and Hull House with having taught her to think clearly and meet events with courage. The memoir ends in Chicago in 1935 with the death of Jane Addams, but Polacheck's experiences after 1935 renewed her cooperative agency and set the stage for the narrative reconstruction of her experiences at the settlement. Polacheck remained a lifelong member and delegate of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and joined in their call for all nations to abolish military conscription. As a mature woman in her 50s, Polacheck was active with Russian war relief and continued to support the causes of organized labor and women's rights through the 1930s. Where she was an outspoken opponent of the rise of fascism in Europe. Around 1936, she established a cooperative student boarding house near the University of Chicago. Dina Epstein, who attended the University of Chicago from 1934 to 1937, recalled that her mother was surrounded by radical students who greatly admired her. A Cold War-era report by the Federal Bureau of Investigation identified the main floor dining room of Polacheck's boarding house as a meeting place for the John Reed branch of the Young Communist League, a network of young leftist writers. The boarding house hosted cultural events and activities, including an artist group and a little theater modeled on the arts and theater groups at Hull House. Students could browse copies of the Daily Worker and publications of the International Workers' Order in the common rooms. In 1937, Hilda Polacheck served bowls of soup to striking Republic steel workers in the days before the infamous Memorial Day massacre, when off-duty Chicago police officers shot and killed 10 unarmed demonstrators. Through such activities and her published writings, Hilda Polacheck's name found its way into the files of the Chicago Police Department's strike-breaking industrial detail of the Red Squad, which monitored left-wing activities and blamed communists for inciting the Memorial Day March. Around 1937, Federal Emergency Relief Administration of the Roosevelt administration hired Polacheck to help select tenants for the Jane Addams housing project near Hull House. And a year later, she became a writer for the Federal Writers Project, which offered relief for unemployed writers and journalists during the Great Depression. At the Chicago office of the Writers Project, Polacheck worked alongside prominent American artists and writers, including Nelson Algren, Arnabon Tomps, Jack Conroy, Richard Wright, and Margaret Walker. In her early writings for the WPA, Hilda Polacheck reinterpreted the ideology of Jane Addams within a proletarian framework, merging the social democratic values of the settlement with the leftist politics she shared with many of her fellow WPA writers. Addams' authority bolstered Polacheck's claim that tolerance of radical political views strengthened democracy. As in the letter to the Charities and the Commons, Polacheck's authority derives from her status as a representative of the immigrant and marginalized communities whose experiences and perspectives validated Addams' claims. In 1949, Polacheck's daughter, Dina Epstein, had been forced to leave her prized position as a cataloger for the U.S. Library of Congress in the wake of a months-long investigation of her loyalty to the United States, conducted under the personal direction of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. Although the FBI and Loyalty Review Board found no evidence of disloyalty to the United States or any other violation of federal law, Epstein was fired for refusing to respond to charges that she had participated in Communist Party meetings and affiliated groups. In addition to mutual ideological support, Polacheck and Epstein shared a commitment to writing as a means of cultural remembrance and change. Polacheck wrote the first draft of her memoir around 1953 at the Epstein's home in New Jersey. Polacheck provided childcare, meals, and moral support for Dina and Mort Epstein, both of whose civil service careers were ended by the Red Scare. In the 1980s, Polacheck's daughter, Dina Epstein, edited her mother's memoir from 7 incomplete drafts for its posthumous publication in 1989. Dina's award-winning book, Sinful Tunes and Spirituals, Black Folk Music to the Civil War, was a product of more than 20 years of research and was published to wide critical acclaim in 1977. I Came a Stranger was published in 1989 after many years of painstaking research, editing, and documentation by Epstein. The autobiography remains a remarkable collaborative achievement, bringing to bear the story of a writer who, like her contemporary Tillie Olson, had nearly remained mute, a writer of a class, sex, color, still marginal in literature, and whose coming to written voice at all against complex odds is an exhausting achievement. In the end, the source of Hilda Satt Polacheck's authority was her lived experience and representation of the collective voice of the people. She enacted agency across time and through diverse networks at opportune moments for collective action. As Polacheck wrote over a century ago, now is the proper time. I bid you peace.